Good morning. We're here today to start our second lesson on Daniel. It's going to be a lesson that kind of touches each of the chapters up through chapter 6. Most of the stories you've already heard as a child and perhaps as an adult. Famous stories of the Old Testament, the fiery furnace, the lion's den, the statues in dream interpretations. So before we get started, let's bow our heads for a moment of prayer. Our Father, thank you for the opportunity to study your word. Help us understand what took place back in Daniel's day and understand how that might apply to us today to improve our faith, to make us understand your role in today's world. In thy name we pray. Amen. Well, in last Sunday's lesson, we are introduced to Daniel and his three teenage friends. In chapter 1 of the Daniel story, these four teenagers were asked to put their faith aside by participating in a training program offered by the Babylonians that would require them to have a diet that violated Mosaic law. And of course, they refused to compromise their faith, and with God's help, they were allowed to eat foods acceptable to Jewish dietary rules, and in fact, showed their captives that their diets made them better fit than many of the colleagues that were in the training program. But the pressure on these young men to conform to the society in which they were captive continues and even intensifies over these next several chapters as we proceed through the book of Daniel. So let's start off with chapter 2. In chapter 2, we see the reason that God allows these young men to come under intense training. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, has a disturbing dream about the image of a man with a strange body. It is a head of gold, shoulders of silver, midsection of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of clay and iron. And hopefully I'll have a picture for you to visually create in your mind to understand as we look through this. And in chapter 7, next Sunday, we'll talk more in depth about what the dream means. Daniel gets some interpretation today, but it's even clearer in chapter 7. The king calls upon his wisest advisors, and he asks them not only to interpret the dream, but to tell them what the dream was. That makes sense to me. If you were trying to determine if your wise men really understood what was going on, they should be able to say what the dream was. Of course, that creates problems for the wise men. So let's open up with Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. In the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the king had a dream that disturbed him so much that he was unable to fall asleep. So the king sent for his usual advisors, magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and other Chaldean wise men to come and help him understand the dream. They came and stood before the troubled king. Nebuchadnezzar says, "I've had a dream that disturbed me. I know I am not going to have peace until I know what it means." The wise men respond, "Long live the king. We are your servants. Tell us your dreams, and we will tell you what it means." The king is sly. Nebuchadnezzar responds, "My mind is made up. My decree is firm. If you do not tell me what I dreamed and what it means, you will be torn apart limb from limb, and those houses of yours will be turned into piles of rubble. But if you do tell me what I dreamed and what it means, then you can expect to receive great honor, gifts, and other rewards as I see fit. So tell me the details of the dream and what it means." Well, of course, the wise man can't describe the dream for the king, let alone interpret it. The king was going to kill all the wise men, which included Daniel, by the way, and his friends. Daniel therefore goes to the king and says to him, "No wise man can tell the king what his dream was or interpret it, but God can." Daniel had prayed for God's help, and in front of the king, he not only describes the dream Nebuchadnezzar has, but he interprets it based upon what God has told him. And so we're going to skip in chapter 2 over to verse 36. In your dream, you were looking, O king, and suddenly a great statue, what appeared to be a man, stood before you. It was enormous in size, shining bright as the sun at noonday. Its appearance was frightening. The head of its statue was fashioned of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its trunk and thighs of bronze, its calves of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you were watching, a special stone was quarried and cut, but not by human hands. The divinely hewn stone began to move, and it struck the statue on its clay and iron feet and smashed them to pieces. Suddenly, the entire statue collapsed. Its iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold were all broken into pieces and turned to dust, like the chaff carried away by the wind from the threshing floors in summer. Soon not a trace of the statue was left, but the divinely hewn stone that struck the statue became a mountain that filled the whole earth. That, good king, was your dream. Well, he goes on then to explain the dream, and let's do that, 36 through 43. If you allow, we will now tell you what it all means. You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has conferred upon you the kingdom you now rules, along with the power and the strength and the glory to subdue it. He has placed all people everywhere, and all the beasts that roam the fields, and all the birds that fly in the sky under your control. He has made you ruler over all. You are the head of gold. So he's identified Nebuchadnezzar and the head as the empire of Babylon. After your reign is over, another kingdom will rise, but its glory will never match yours. This lesser kingdom is a chest and arms of silver. When that kingdom has come and gone, a third and even less majestic empire will rise, which will rule over the whole earth. This kingdom is the trunk and thighs of bronze. Then when the days are past, a fourth kingdom will come to power with the strength of iron, though lacking in grandeur. Just as iron breaks and shatters everything, so this kingdom will break and shatter all those former realms. But as you saw in your vision, this kingdom will be divided, with feet and toes made of both clay and iron. The strength of iron runs through it, but as the toes are made partly of iron and partly of clay, the kingdom too will be partly strong and partly fragile. Your dream envisions that this kingdom of iron mixed with clay will be of peoples mixed but not united. The kingdoms joined in the bonds of marriage, but not true allies, for iron and clay form no ally. So Daniel doesn't go as far to identify who these kingdoms are, but he identifies 4 different kingdoms. At the end of his explanation, Daniel tells the king then that a kingdom God will establish and will force the king to recognize absolute sovereign government of God. So these are all earthly kingdoms. And then in verse 44, Daniel says, but there is another kingdom, a kingdom that God will establish upon the earth. And this is the kingdom that is referred to in the end times, that we have already alluded to and talked about the events of the end times. So let's see what Daniel says. Verse 44. In the days when these kings of iron and clay reign, the God of heaven will set up another kingdom, a kingdom that can never be destroyed, a kingdom that will never be ruled by others. It will crush all the other kingdoms and bring them to an end. This kingdom will last forever. So there's an apocalyptic and eschatological view of the world that Daniel says, after all these earthly kingdoms have passed, God will establish his kingdom on earth that will last forever. So after chapter 2, Daniel gets into another explanation. He and his 3 friends, having been successful in interpreting the dream, become active members in the government of Babylonia. In chapter 3, we have the story of the fiery furnace. The king has his image constructed in a gold-plated idol 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, a huge thing. The king prepares an elaborate ceremony in which he invites all the government leaders to dedicate the statue. Now, as this empire grows, and I can understand Nebuchadnezzar's intent, the government has to expand as the territory expands. And the king needs government officials who are loyal to him. The power of the king must be felt through his officials or through the government as they administer justice, they protect the land, and collect taxes across this vast conquered land. So at the ceremony, when the music starts, Nebuchadnezzar requires all his officials to bow down to the statue or suffer the consequences. And we see much the same kind of attitudes. North Korea comes to mind, where the leader of North Korea is prepared, or is the propaganda that the people have almost makes him a divine person, that he can do no wrong. And in order for a dictator or a king to properly control his subjects, they all have to view him with a certain kind of fear. And so that's what Nebuchadnezzar attempts to do here. So let's go to chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. People of all nations and languages, by order of the king, you are commanded to bow down and worship the golden statue erected by King Nebuchadnezzar. Every time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, lute, harp, pipe, and all the other musical instruments, anyone who does not obey the king's command and refuses to bow down and worship will be taken immediately and thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Well, of course, the Jews can't do this. The Daniel and his 3 teenage buddies, they can't do this. And when that happens, Nebuchadnezzar goes into a rage. He calls Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before him. And the response they get when he questions them as to why they do not fall down is similar to many of the saints who are asked to compromise their faith. And so in chapter 3, verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar speaking. It is reported to me that you, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse to serve my gods and do not bow and worship the golden statue I had set up. Is that true? If you are ready to comply with my order and fall down and worship the statue I have made, when you hear the sound of the music and other musical instruments, then things will go well for you from here. But if you refuse to worship, you will be taken immediately, thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. What God can possibly rescue you from my hands then? And Shadrach and Meshach respond. Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to defend our actions in this matter. We are ready for the test. If you throw us into the blazing furnace, then the God we serve is able to rescue us from a furnace that is of blazing fire and release us from your power, your majesty. But even if he does not, O king, you can be sure that we still will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue you have erected. These young men of conviction raise the ire of the king. He gets angry. He orders the furnace to be made even hotter, so hot, in fact, that soldiers who take the 3 young men to throw them into the furnace die as a result of the heat. I'm in chapter 3, verse 22. The furnace was so hot, and the king's command carried out so quickly without any precautions, that the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up to the furnace were themselves killed by the heat of the raging fire. And the 3 Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, tied and bound, fell into the furnace of blazing fire. Nebuchadnezzar could hardly believe his eyes. Shocked, the king jumped up and asked his advisors, well, didn't we tie up and throw 3 men into the heart of fire? And the advisors say, yes, O king. Then Nebuchadnezzar responds, then why do I see 4 men, completely unbound, walking around in the middle of the fire? They don't appear to be hurt at all. And the 4th, he appears to be like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar moved as close to the door of the furnace as he dared without being scorched. He shouted over the roar of the blazing fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out right now. Come here. So the 3 men made their way out of the fiery furnace. So we know that God, in fact, did protect them. The three men live, and the king again praises the God of the Jews. He is not yet converted. He has not fully released his pride in order to accept the God of the Jews. What a great testimony these three teenagers have made. So we move into chapter 4. King Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that there's something different about this one and only God that the Jews talk about. He has witnessed signs and miracles as a result of Daniel and his friends' faith. Chapter 4 is about the king's conversion. It's about how God breaks down the pride of the world's greatest king and tyrant and takes him to the point of madness. The king has another dream that only Daniel can interpret. He sees a tall, strong, and stately tree with beautiful leaves and plenty of fruit. It is the home of animals and birds. A heavenly messenger cuts down the tree, scattering its leaves. Animals and birds leave. There's only left a stump and the roots intact. So let's go to chapter 4, verse 20. The tree you saw in your vision, Daniel is now explaining the dream to the king. The one which grew tall and strong so that its top reached up to the sky and could be seen from one end of the earth to the other. The tree whose leaves were beautiful and fruit plentiful and provided sustenance for everyone. The tree under which the wild animals came to rest in the cool shade, in which the birds built their nests on its sturdy branches. That tree is you, O king. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown tall and reached the sky. Your authority and power extend to the end of the earth. But that is just part of the dream. The king saw the messenger, the holy watcher of heaven, come down from heaven and declare, "Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump intact, its roots in the ground, strapped down with iron and bronze, surrounded by the tender grass of the field. Let the dew of heaven fall heavenly on it every night, and make it wet, and let him live among the wild animals off the plants of the earth until 7 times have come and gone." Here is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree the Most High God has issued against you, my lord and king. You will be driven away from all that is human and live in the company of wild animals. You will be forced to eat grass like oxen. And night after that, the dew of heaven will fall on you and make you soaking wet. 7 times will pass until you learn your lesson and acknowledge that it is the Most High God and no other who is the true sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and he grants authority to anyone he wishes. The watcher's order to leave the stump and roots of the tree intact means that your kingdom will be restored to you when, and only when, you acknowledge that heaven alone is sovereign over all the earth. So you, O king, please accept my advice to you. Make a clean break with your sins and invest what is right. Bring an end to your wicked deeds and show mercy to those who have been beaten down. If you do, perhaps your future will be different and your prosperity will continue. Well, the king did not heed Daniel's advice. In a prideful moment, King Nebuchadnezzar becomes insane and spends 7 years eating grass like a cow. Verse 28. But King Nebuchadnezzar forgot Daniel's advice, so everything Daniel had predicted happened. 12 months later, as the king was strolling across the roof of his royal palace in Babylon, the king uttered foolish words. He said, "Isn't Babylon a great city? I have built this royal residence from the ground up with my own might and ingenuity to honor my own majesty." The words had scarcely left his lips when another voice thundered from heaven. "King Nebuchadnezzar, those solemn words are for you. The kingdom has been taken away from you. You will be driven away from all that is human, and you will live in the company of wild animals. You will be forced to eat grass like oxen. 7 times will pass, and you will learn your lesson and acknowledge that it is the Most High God and no other who is a true sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and he grants authority to anyone he wishes." Instantly, the heavenly decree against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from all that is human and began to eat grass as oxen do. The dew of heaven fell and drenched his body. In time his hair grew as long as the feathers on an eagle, and his nails grew long and curved back on his hands like the claws of a bird. When these days of exile came to an end, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up toward heaven and came to my senses. I blessed the Most High God and praised and gave glory to the One who lives eternally. His reign will endure forever. His kingdom will last from generation to generation. This is what happens to humans who reject God. They become beastly and brutish. And at the end of 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses, and the king tells how his reason was destroyed by the grace of God. His testimony is as I had read. Let me give you a bit of that in verse 36 and 37 of chapter. It was in that moment that I came to my senses. Soon my honor and splendor were restored, as Daniel predicted, and the former glory of my kingdom returned. Those who had served me before, my advisors and officials, sought me and returned me to the throne of Babylon. In my time, my kingdom and power grew even greater than it was before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, acknowledge the true King of heaven. I praise and lift up and glorify him, because all he does is true. All his ways are just, and he is able to cut down those who strut about in their pride. Isn't it remarkable how the testimony of just a few men can make such a big difference in the administration of a company and in the mind of a king like Nebuchadnezzar? Let's turn to chapter 5. Daniel has lived through almost 3 empires by now. King Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. He was succeeded by his son, who only reigned for 2 years. He was murdered by his brother-in-law, Nabonidus, who killed the king's son in 560 BC, and he took the throne. He ruled for 4 years. He put his son, Belshazzar, on the throne as co-regent and ruling the city of Babylon, while Belshazzar's father and the king, Nabonidus, Nabonidus, was off conquering other countries. And so in the Bible, we read about the stories of Belshazzar. The armies of the Medes and Persians, the next great empire to replace the Babylonians, were at the gates of the city, while Belshazzar held a great feast with thousands in attendance. Chapter 5 opens with the luxury and licentiousness of the Babylonian kingdoms on vivid display in our Bible. The king Belshazzar offers a toast, drunk from the golden vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem when he destroyed them several years earlier. So let's open up this with the description of the festival, the banquet, in Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. A few decades later, the king Belshazzar held a state banquet and invited 1,000 of his officials. As he was tasting the wine, he ordered servants to bring in the silver and gold vessels his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the temple in Jerusalem many years earlier. He wanted his officials to join him, his wives and his concubines, in drinking a royal toast from them. A little later, his servants returned carrying in the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of the one true God in Jerusalem. The king, his officials, his wives, and his concubines began to drink from them. As they drank the wine, they offered praise to their idols, crafted in gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a hand, a human hand, appeared and began to write on the plaster of one of the palace walls, lit by a nearby lampstand. The king stood transfixed, I guess we all would at that point, watching the hand as it wrote. Then his face changed. He grew pale and began to feel sick. His thoughts frightened him. What was this strange vision? His legs felt weak and wobbly, his knees knocked together. The king cried out to his servants, ordering them to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldean wise men, and the diviners. Belshazzar said to his wise men, "A great reward awaits the first person who can read this writing and tell me what it means. He will be clothed in purple, a sign of majesty, wear a gold chain around his neck, and ascend in rank and privilege to be the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Well, in a repeat pattern, this king calls for his wise men an interpretation of this strange writing that they have seen on the palace walls. The wise men, again, cannot succeed, so Daniel is called. The king offers purple robes, gold chains, privileged rank, if Daniel can tell him the meaning. Daniel first reminds the king what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar when the pride got the best of him. Then Daniel tells Belshazzar what the words that are written on the wall, which are Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin, what they mean. And so let's go to verse 22 in chapter 5. But even though you knew all this, you, Belshazzar, his descendant, have followed in his ways and have not lived humbly. On the contrary, you have risen up against the true Lord of heaven by demanding that the sacred vessels from his temple be brought before you, and having you, your officials, your wives, and your concubines drink from them. You have issued a challenge you cannot win. You have made toasts and offered praise to the idols crafted in silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, idols which you cannot see, which cannot see you, hear you, or know anything at all. And you have failed to honor in all that you do the one true God who holds the breath of life in the palm of his hands and makes possible all your days. He is the one who sent this hand and inscribed this message on the wall. This is what the inscription says: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here's what the words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found defective. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and handed over to the Medes and the Persians. It's a judgment on Belshazzar's arrogance that that night God's judgment is carried out. Belshazzar dies, the Persians take over the empire, and King Darius ascends to the throne. Verse 29, true to his word, Belshazzar gave the order, and Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and the king proclaimed that he ascended in rank and privileged to be the third highest ranking ruler in the kingdom. That very night, under the cloak of darkness, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king of Babylonia, was killed. Then Darius the Mede, in his 62nd year, gained control of the kingdom. So that ends chapter 5. Now we move on to chapter 6. Daniel is rewarded again and becomes administrator for yet another king in another kingdom. Daniel doesn't really care about this because the true God of Hebrews, is always with him. Chapter 6 is yet another demonstration of God's provision in times of pressure and even seemingly hopelessness. This is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel's jealous rivals try to destroy him. They manipulate King Darius into issuing a decree that Daniel cannot obey. When they catch Daniel praying to God in violation of Darius's decree, they report him. So I'm in chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. Darius decided to rule by stationing 120 officers strategically over the entire empire. Over the officers, he appointed 3 governors, including Daniel, and required each officer to report directly to them. This way, the new king hoped not to lose any territory from his recent conquests or revenue that they provided. Because of Daniel's exceptional ability, it wasn't long before he distinguished himself over the other governors and officers. So the king decided to appoint him as head over the entire realm, like a prime minister. This appointment did not sit well with the other leaders, so the governors and the officers tried to find reasons to level charges against Daniel for the way he supervised the kingdom. Though they tried, they could find no basis for charges or corruption in his office. Daniel was loyal and attentive to his duties. The conspirators said, "We will never find any credible basis for charges against Daniel for how he conducts his office. Perhaps we can uncover some suitable charge in regard to the law of his God." The governors and the officers agreed and went to the king with what they thought would be a way to entrap Daniel. The conspirators say to the king, "May King Darius live forever. All the leaders of the empire, the governors, prefects, officers, and advisors and administrators have consulted together on a complete agreement that the king should issue an edict and enforce it strictly to the effect that anyone who prays to another, whether divine or human, except for you, of course, good king, for a period of 30 days will be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, we ask that you establish such an ordinance and sign it into law so that it cannot be changed, for the laws enacted by the Medes and Persians cannot be rescinded." After considering their proposal, King Darius signed the ordinance and made it into law. So Darius signs his ordinance into law, and once decreed, it couldn't be revoked. Now, Daniel continues to pray 3 times a day as his standard procedure in his home. And one day, his conspirators catch him on his knees praying, and they report Daniel to the king. The law forbade anyone to pray to another, whether divine or human, other than Darius for 30 days, or else they would be thrown into the lion's den. Chapter 6, verse 13. Well, recently we found your servant, Daniel, as one of the exiles from Judah, kneeling and praying at his home 3 times a day to his God. He is ignoring you, O king, and the edict you signed into law. When the king heard the charge, he was very upset. He thought a great deal of Daniel, so he tried to figure out a way to help him. All day long until evening, he looked for some loophole in the law to keep Daniel from falling victim to his edict. The conspirators returned to press the matter further. Darius called Daniel before him. Darius thought a great deal of Daniel, as we read, and was sorry to have to carry out this act. He hoped that Daniel's God would protect him, and we know that God shut the lion's mouth, and Daniel was again delivered by the hand of God. And as a result of this, Darius issued a decree exalting Daniel's God as the one true living God. Daniel continued to thrive and serve into the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And the last couple verses, verse 26. "I declare that all people everywhere who live under my sovereign rule ought to tremble before and fear the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be overthrown. His reign will know no end. He saves and rescues those who fear him, performing signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for he has rescued his servant Daniel from the power of the lions." Pretty good stories in Daniel. And in the next chapter, we start the futuristic focus section of Daniel. Chapter 7 opens with the vision of the 4 beasts, covering the same time period as the image in chapter 2. And we'll see how Daniel's prophecies turned out to tell how the world's empires would unfold over the next 300 years. Let's bow our heads. Thank you, Lord, for your lessons today. Continue to be with us throughout the week and bring us back safely again next Sunday. In thy name we pray. Amen. Have a great week.